The main armament of the submarine USS L-2 was a single 3-inch deck gun. It was mounted on the forward deck and had a semi-retractable design. When submerging, the gun was lowered into a watertight recess, protecting its mechanisms from the water while the barrel remained just above the deck. This was the first gun installed on United States Navy submarines. It could fire 8 to 9 rounds per minute with an ammunition load of 18 shells. This allowed the boat to engage in surface combat against merchant vessels or small ships during coastal patrols. The USS L-2 also had 4 18-inch bow torpedo tubes. This was a standard setup for L-class submarines, as they were primarily designed for ambushes and head-on attacks. In total, the submarine carried 8 torpedoes, 4 in the tubes and 4 reloads. They could hit targets at a range of about 3,200 yards at a speed of 27 knots. This was perfectly suited for the close-range combat typical of the early 20th century. There were no aft torpedo tubes. Although this reduced tactical flexibility, the approach fully met the requirements of coastal defense. The equipment of the USS L-2 reflected the technology level of the early First World War. Inside the conning tower, right next to the control systems, were 2 periscopes measuring 8 and 16 feet long, used for search and attack. Primitive hydrophones were used for underwater detection. Their effectiveness was low, but after the war, during experiments aboard the L-2, they were upgraded to better track torpedoes and other submarines along the Atlantic coast. There were no dedicated anti-aircraft guns initially, but if needed, the deck gun could be used for defense against aircraft. The crew consisted of 28 officers and enlisted sailors. Living quarters were located in the forward and aft battery compartments. Compressed air reserves and life support systems were sufficient for 24 hours submerged. This was enough for short maneuvers or ambushes. The USS L-2 was designed as an early ship hunter, so the main focus was on stealth and quick strikes rather than long endurance. The submarine featured a diesel-electric power plant, which was typical for the early 20th century. On the surface, it ran on 2 diesel engines, producing 600 horsepower each. They drove twin propellers. While submerged, propulsion came from 2 electric motors, generating 450 horsepower each. They were powered by onboard batteries and allowed the submarine to move completely silently, which was critical for its stealth. The electrical system included 2 large lead-acid battery banks. They were charged by the diesels while running on the surface and provided energy for diving. The surface speed reached 14 knots, and the submerged speed was 10.5 knots. At a speed of 11 knots, the submarine could cover 3,400 nautical miles on the surface. Underwater, it could cruise at a speed of 3 knots for no more than 24 hours. The whole design ensured high hydrodynamic efficiency. Surface displacement was 450 long tons, and submerged displacement was 548 long tons. The length of the submarine was 167 feet and 5 inches. The beam was 17 feet and 5 inches, and the draft was 13 feet and 7 inches. The maximum diving depth was 150 feet. These dimensions and the diesel-electric plant made the USS L-2 well-balanced for coastal patrols, even though it suffered from the mechanical issues typical of machinery from that era. L-class submarines, including L-2, were approved by the United States Navy in 1913. This was part of the Coastal Defense Expansion Program. The new requirements called for greater range, speed, and better crew conditions compared to previous classes. These submarines became a step toward more versatile vessels capable of extended patrols. They were specifically funded to reduce the electric boat company's monopoly by bringing in designs from competitors. The contract for L-2 still went to Electric Boat, but the actual construction was subcontracted to the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. This was a common practice that allowed using the experience of specialized facilities while keeping the original designer's blueprints. This approach ensured the rapid production of submarines from L-1 to L-4 and from L-9 to L-11. They differed significantly from the competing designs of the late Torpedo Boat Company, which built models from L-5 to L-8. The keel for L-2 was laid down on March 19, 1914. This kicked off the construction of a steel vessel measuring 167 feet and 5 inches in length, designed for reconnaissance and fighting other submarines. The pressure hull was assembled from riveted steel plates. Inside, they installed sturdy bulkheads that divided the space into watertight compartments. These included the torpedo room, the forward battery compartment, the control room, the aft battery compartment with the mess, and the engine room. The electric boat design featured the rudder and aft dive planes on a single axis, while the propeller shafts were positioned on the sides for better maneuverability. The forward torpedo tubes were fitted with individual doors instead of the single rotating cap used on older classes. The power plant consisted of 2 diesel engines. They turned generators to power the electric motors, which provided high reliability during coastal operations. The hull shape was optimized for stability, and the shaft layout differed from the twin-screw system of their competitors. L-2 was launched on February 11, 1915. The ship's sponsor was Mrs. Russell Gray, the wife of the submarine's future commanding officer. This event was preceded by about 11 months of hull assembly and initial fitting out. It proved the Four River Shipyard's ability to build submarines quickly amid the growing needs of the fleet. Among the engineering improvements was reinforced framing for sailing in stormy conditions. This set a kind of standard for the company's future designs, where submerged efficiency was combined with excellent surface seakeeping. After launching, the L-2 submarine underwent further fitting out. She was equipped with engines, internal systems, and basic navigational instruments. This work took up most of 1915, as the boat was prepared for full-scale sea trials. Sea trials began in March 1916 near Provincetown, Massachusetts. Under the close watch of military inspectors, the boat reached a surface speed of 14 knots. This fully confirmed the reliability of her diesel-electric power plant. During the tests, they checked engine performance, hull strength, and basic maneuverability. No serious defects that could delay handing the boat over to the military were found. Due to the escalating global conflict, the United States accelerated the buildup of its submarine fleet, even though the country had not yet entered the First World War. The boat was officially commissioned on September 29, 1916, at the Boston Navy Yard. Her first commanding officer was Lieutenant Junior Grade Augustine H. Gray. Final fitting out lasted until October. The submarine was equipped with radios, additional navigation equipment, and loaded with torpedoes received at the base in Newport, Rhode Island. At this stage, engineers also made minor adjustments to the engines and other systems, but this did not cause any delays, and the vessel was fully ready for service. In late 1916, after successful weapons trials off the coast of New England, the Navy commissioned the submarine L-2 into service. From October 28th to November 30th, the first test cruises took place in the waters of New England and Long Island Sound. Under the supervision of the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Division, the crew tested diving, surfacing, and submerged endurance. All design specifications were confirmed. These maneuvers off the Connecticut coast allowed the boat to be transferred to the fleet in a state of full combat readiness by early December. The short test period quickly turned into a long cruise along the American coast. After dropping off a sick sailor in Newport, Rhode Island, the submarine headed south on December 1st. Making a stop at the Delaware Breakwater, the boat arrived at the Norfolk Navy Yard on December 8th, where it remained until the 18th. Then it moved on and arrived in Key West, Florida on December 23rd to replenish fuel and provisions and undergo an additional technical inspection. On December 30th, L-2 crossed the strait and arrived in Havana, Cuba. There, the crew celebrated the New Year and on January 2nd, 1917, returned to Key West. These transits gave the sailors invaluable experience in navigation and logistics over distances that far exceeded short test runs near the shipyard. In the first months of 1917, the boat operated in the waters between Key West, the Dry Tortugas, Pensacola, and Mobile. On January 28th, L-2 arrived in Pensacola. Then, from February 17th to the 21st, it was based in Mobile, after which it returned to Pensacola again. On March 9th, the submarine took part in exercises in the Gulf of Mexico alongside the monitor Tallahassee and the cruiser Columbia. Meanwhile, the strategic situation in the world was changing rapidly. On February 1st, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Because of this, the Atlantic Fleet cut short its winter exercises near Cuba and concentrated its forces in the lower Chesapeake Bay. On March 27th, L-2 left Pensacola and, passing through Key West, arrived at Hampton Roads on April 5th, exactly one day before the United States declared war on Germany. From the moment it was commissioned on September 29, 1916, L-2 belonged to Submarine Division 5 of the Atlantic Fleet. Initially, it was based on the east coast of the United States and in the Gulf of Mexico. After America entered the First World War on April 6, 1917, the boat underwent a mobilization refit at the Norfolk Navy Yard. In May, it was transferred to Philadelphia for a major overhaul and preparation for overseas anti-submarine operations. In late November, having completed all preparations, L-2 left the East Coast, towed by the ship Conestoga. On December 4th, it headed for the Azores and, making stops in New London and Bermuda, arrived in Ponta Delgada on December 18th. Mobilization began almost immediately after arriving in Norfolk. The crew carried out minor hull repairs, and on April 13th, the submarine officially received orders to prepare for combat. 3 days later, L-2 moved to Yorktown, where she joined the ship Bushnell and the submarines L-1 and L-3 to prepare for a massive fleet concentration in Chesapeake Bay. On April 30th, the group headed to Tangier Sound, and on May 4th, L-2, along with Bushnell and the other submarines, sailed for Philadelphia. All vessels successfully reached the naval shipyard on May 6th. The refit that began afterward was not just routine maintenance. Its main goal was to make the coastal submarine as reliable as possible for extended service on the other side of the Atlantic. The decision to send American submarines across the ocean was based on British experience. Vice Admiral William Sowden Sims reported that a submarine could sometimes approach a German U-boat much more quietly and stealthily than a destroyer or patrol vessel. On July 2, 1917, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral William Shepard Benson ordered the 12 best submarines of the Atlantic Fleet to be prepared for service in Europe. The submarine L-2 remained in Philadelphia for an extensive overhaul. After an equipment inspection on November 14th, the discovered defects took another 3 days to fix. On November 18th, L-2 departed Philadelphia alongside the submarines L-1, L-3, L-4, L-9, L-10, L-11, and E-1, the support ships Bushnell and Fulton, and the tugboat Conestoga. In New London and Newport, the crews conducted training, loaded supplies, and prepared for the crossing. The transit itself clearly showed why submarines needed tugs and support ships. To save fuel and preserve the engines, L-2 was towed by Conestoga. On December 4th, after leaving Melville, Rhode Island, the squadron was hit by a severe storm that scattered the ships. On December 13th, they regrouped near the Bermuda Islands before continuing east. On December 17th, L-2 reached Fayal Island in the Azores, and the very next day entered the port of Ponta Delgada. The crew spent the rest of the month refueling, replenishing supplies, and making repairs. On December 31st, the boat put to sea to relieve L-10 on patrol. Although there were reports of German U-boat attacks on merchant vessels near the islands, L-2 successfully completed this and several subsequent January patrols without any incidents. From late December 1917 to January 1918, L-2 continued to patrol the Azores, relieving other crews and hunting for enemy U-boats. On January 19, 1918, the boat, along with its division and escorted by American destroyers, left Ponta Delgada. On January 27th, they arrived in Queenstown, Ireland. There, the submarines came under the command of Vice Admiral William Sowden Sims and British Admiral Sir Lewis Bailey. Due to a lack of space in the port, the boat was transferred to Bearhaven in Bantry Bay. To avoid confusing it with British submarines, L-2 was renamed AL-2. From February 6th to February 16th, the crew underwent training. They practiced diving, tactical maneuvers, and used Royal Navy attack simulators aboard the ship Vulcan. On March 18, 1918, AL-2 began regular 8-day patrols past the Fastnet Rock Lighthouse. The main objective was intercepting German U-boats in close coordination with Allied aviation and surface vessels. After arriving in Ireland, the American crews did not operate independently. Although they remained under the overall command of Vice Admiral Sims, locally they were commanded by the Commander-in-Chief of the coast of Ireland, Vice Admiral Sir Lewis Bailey, and the Commander of the Royal Navy Submarine Forces, Captain Sir Martin Naismith. Initially, Bailey allowed only one American submarine to be at sea at a time. British officers had to receive reports on every departure and return to base. The patrol zone was deliberately shifted farther away from the Fastnet Rock lighthouse. This was done to separate the submarines from the heavy traffic of Allied patrol vessels near the coast. These strict limitations pointed to a very serious problem. An Allied submarine hunting a U-boat could easily be mistaken for the enemy by destroyers, aircraft, or other submarines. An 8-day cycle set a clear rhythm for the crews. After a patrol, the sailors spent about 8 days in port. This time was spent resting, resupplying, making repairs, servicing the batteries, and preparing for the next mission. Before beginning these rotations, American officers practiced attacks on a special Royal Navy simulator aboard the ship Vulcan, while the submarines conducted dives and tactical maneuvers in Bantry Bay. A large letter A on the conning tower was supposed to distinguish the submarine L-2 and other boats of this series from the British L-class submarines. However, identifying them at sea was still difficult. A low profile, poor visibility, stormy weather, and primitive communication equipment repeatedly led to Allies nearly attacking their own submarines. On July 10, 1918, about 15 miles south of the Fastnet Lighthouse, a revealing incident occurred. A torpedo from the German U-boat UB-65 passed by the American submarine and exploded 200 feet from the engine room. The crew crash dived to 70 feet and began pursuing the attacker using sonar. They heard explosions, which could indicate damage to the German boat. However, the later sinking of UB-65 off the coast of Cornwall was deemed accidental. Under the command of Lieutenant Paul Frederick Foster from May 1918, the submarine L-2 continued patrolling throughout the summer. In stormy seas, the crew recorded unconfirmed contacts with the enemy several times. On September 24, 1918, the submarine transferred to the English port of Devonport, where it served as a training target for American submarine chasers. The boat remained in service until the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. It took an active part in defending Allied convoys, although it had no confirmed destroyed enemy targets. One of the most revealing patrols began on May 25, 1918. The next day, at a distance of about 6 miles, the crew of L-2 spotted a vessel resembling an enemy submarine and moved to intercept. The submarine submerged. The crew scanned the horizon through the periscope and listened through sonar, but the contact was lost. Later that same day, about 3 miles away, another conning tower appeared. The submarine L-2 submerged again and began to close in. The sailors heard a faint sound, but still could not identify the target. When the unknown object was spotted for the third time, the crew flooded the torpedo tubes and moved into firing position. But even then, uncertainty prevented an attack. This decision clearly demonstrates the dangers of the patrol zone. A premature shot could destroy an Allied submarine, while waiting too long gave a German U-boat a chance to escape. Because the batteries were running low, L-2 eventually surfaced to recharge them. The danger of friendly fire became real on the morning of July 10th, a few hours before the encounter attributed to the German U-boat UB-65. Returning to Berehaven, the submarine L-2 encountered the American destroyers Parker and McCall. The submarine sent a signal with a signal lamp and released smoke floats for identification. Despite this, one of the destroyers opened fire from a distance of about 6,000 yards. The crew of L-2 released 5 more smoke floats and continued signaling with the Aldous lamp. The destroyer managed to fire 5 shots before recognizing its own submarine at a distance of about 2,000 yards. No shells hit. This episode proved that even a clearly marked American submarine could be mistaken for an enemy vessel during those few tense seconds allowed for identification. Later that day, around 5:55 p.m., a lookout spotted a dark object off the starboard side, which was initially mistaken for a buoy. At 6:30 p.m., a torpedo explosion sounded about 200 feet from the engine room of L-2. An enemy periscope was visible just 80 yards off the starboard side. Lieutenant Foster ordered the rudder hard to port and executed a crash dive to a depth of about 70 feet. According to the logbooks, the sailors heard several underwater noises and sonar signals. L-2 attempted to pursue one of the contacts while submerged. Foster later reported that he tried to ram the enemy underwater. The submarine repeatedly stopped its own engines to listen. The crew circled the area for over 2 hours and eventually surfaced, having completely lost contact with the target. At the time, the sounds and an unexplained explosion led the Americans to believe that the German U-boat might have been destroyed. Foster later received the Distinguished Service Medal for his actions in an encounter believed to have caused the loss of the enemy vessel. The target was identified as UB-65, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Martin Schell. Later, German findings did not confirm an American kill. In 1930, the German Admiralty concluded that UB-65 had sunk in an accident with all 37 men aboard off Cornwall on or after July 14, 1918. The incident remained an example of how incomplete reports, underwater noise, and delayed intelligence could shape wartime conclusions. The hazards did not end with that engagement. On July 20th, the destroyer Allen and the fuel ship Kanawha sighted a submarine on the surface at night. They opened fire before recognition signals identified it as L-2. The submarine escaped damage. On August 25th, L-2 heard what was believed to be another submarine, but rough seas made raising the periscope dangerous because the top of the submarine could become visible between the waves. 3 days later, she reported another possible contact, yet nearly exhausted batteries prevented a chase. These episodes show how weather and electrical endurance could be just as decisive as weapons. On September 24th, L-2 left Berehaven for Devonport and operated from the Plymouth area as a training target for American submarine chasers until the armistice. Following the end of World War I, USS L-2 returned to the United States and resumed operational duties along the Atlantic coast, where she conducted experiments with torpedo and undersea detection techniques and equipment. In August 1920, she entered the Norfolk Navy Yard for an overhaul, emerging on September 15th to continue her activities. By November 1920, she was transferred, along with several sister ships, to the Submarine Repair Division at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, serving in an inactive status with Submarine Division 3 after the division was reorganized in March 1921. The voyage home began only after several weeks of preparation. L-2 left Plymouth on December 10, 1918, and reached the dockyard at Portland the next day, remaining there through the end of the year. She sailed for the United States on January 3, 1919, reached Ponta Delgada on January 10th, and first secured alongside the destroyer Yarnall before shifting to the Bushnell. Departing the Azores on January 14th, she arrived at the British dockyard in Bermuda on January 26th. After fuel and provisions were taken aboard, she continued on January 28th and entered the Philadelphia Navy Yard on February 1st. The westbound route through the Azores and Bermuda reflected the limited endurance and maintenance needs of submarines designed before regular transatlantic deployment had become an expected mission. Her return also marked the end of the temporary AL designation. The submarine once again became L-2. Post-war experiments with torpedoes and underwater detection equipment were significant because wartime patrols had exposed the weaknesses of the acoustic systems of that era. Crews could hear machinery or signals beneath the surface, but determining range, direction, identity, and even the number of contacts was extremely difficult. Work conducted by submarines like L-2 formed part of the gradual transition from primitive listening devices toward more systematic undersea detection and tracking methods. In September 1921, the submarine L-2 was towed to the base in New London, Connecticut. There, she was fitted with new main engines from N-class submarines. On December 5th of that same year, the boat was returned to service, but only in reserve. On May 1st, 1922, L-2 was placed in a state of reduced readiness as part of Submarine Division 0. Due to the reduction in operations, only a minimal crew was left on board for maintenance. In January 1923, the boat briefly transferred to the Portsmouth Navy Yard for docking and repairs. By March, she returned to New London and later that month set sail for Hampton Roads, Virginia. The transfer to New London was part of a larger plan. The Navy was trying to preserve its older submarines amid shrinking post-war budgets. As early as February 3, 1921, the tug Kalmia delivered L-2 to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. In August, orders arrived to transfer the boat to New London for engine replacement, and on September 21st, Kalmia completed the tow. In April 1922, the fleet still considered the submarines L-2, L-3, L-9, and L-11 to be reserve vessels in good working condition. However, the reduced readiness status meant they were no longer suited for intensive frontline service. The small crews focused on preserving equipment, conducting tests, and making basic movements rather than undertaking long combat patrols. On May 4, 1923, L-2 was finally decommissioned at Hampton Roads, ending her active service. However, decommissioning did not mean immediate scrapping. In April 1924, L-2 and 25 other submarines were sent to Philadelphia to prepare for disposal. Over the summer, the boat was dry docked, and then on August 18th, the minesweeper Owl took her under tow. The next day, L-2 arrived at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where she remained under Navy Guard for a few more years while politicians decided the fate of the old submarines. On December 18, 1930, the boat was struck from the register, and on June 25, 1933, she was sold for scrap to the Pottstown Steel Company under the terms of the London Naval Treaty. On November 28th of that same year, L-2 was finally dismantled. Her participation in interwar experiments helped the United States Navy shape early tactics for submarine detection and torpedo employment.